Hey Dad, what's the punkest thing you ever did?
The punkest thing I ever did? Resist mediocrity.
It's the Punkest Thing Podcast with your host, Gregory Downey.
I'm coloring outside your guideline. I was passing out when you were passing out your room. 1, 2, 3, 4, who's punk? What's the score?
Check it out. This is the Punkest Thing Podcast. I'm your host, the punkest daddy of them all, Gregory Downey, known to some as the Gratitude Coach. And this is episode number 1 of the Punkest Thing Podcast, titled, Check 1, 2. Is this thing on? I want to welcome you to this very first episode, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your life to listen to this podcast. In the words of Dave Spicoli, I'm here and you're here, so this is our time, and I'm going to bring you value on our time. I'll tell you, I can't say how super excited I am for this first episode. And you know, I almost didn't record it. I almost talked myself out of it again because I was going to start a podcast it was 4 or 5 years ago. I did a promo, I did a first episode, and I ended up talking myself out of it. And the reason I was going to talk myself out of it this time was because I got sick a few days ago and my voice is just not back to normal. And I was kind of telling myself, yeah, you know, you could just wait until your voice sounds better and you know, people will like it more and, you know, blah, 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 you know, the stories that we tell ourselves. And even though I've been coaching, you know, personal development and mindset, you know, for years, I still sometimes have programs. And I was doing a session with my coach on Tuesday, and I was telling him what was going on, and he said, Gregory, he said, just do it. He said, don't worry whether or not people think your voice sounds great, because they know that you're human, and humans get sick. And he said, if you bring them value, he said, they'll keep coming back, and then they'll get to hear you when you sound better. He said, so just go ahead with it. Go ahead and just bring value, and people will love it for what it is, and most importantly, to do it with love. And that is absolutely why I'm doing this podcast. I always like to start with why. And so, you know, when I think, well, why this podcast? Why this title? Why this subject? You know, it really comes down to the fact that within the punk rock subculture, you know, there's this philosophy, right, that's about not conforming. I mean, punk is about not conforming. It's about being a nonconformist. But the irony, there's a huge irony that goes into this because if you look at well, what is the punk ethos? It's primarily made up of beliefs that are based around nonconformity, anti-authoritarianism, anti-corporatism, you know, a real DIY or do-it-yourself ethic. And, you know, it doesn't get any more DIY than this. Like I'm actually doing this podcast in a dank basement that has been set up as a music space. My microphone booth is a repurposed milk crate with some packing foam. You know, so it doesn't get any more DIY than this. But within the punk subculture, there exist these oxymorons that have driven me nuts for years. And the first one is, well, you know, you have to do this or you have to do that or you're not punk, right? That if you do this, it's not punk. If you do that, you know, it's not punk. In fact, and I'm going to dedicate my whole next episode to this kind of double-edged thinking that exists within the punk subculture. And so I was driven by that when I was thinking about, you know, well, what I was going to base my podcast around. But the most important thing, the most important why, is because I know that there are people in the world, in fact, every human being in the world was born with some level of greatness within them. And I have seen so many people in my life settle for mediocrity. I have seen them settle for less because they get brainwashed by these ideologies that say, well, you can't be this, or you can't be that, or you can't do that. And so they end up just settling for being average. And I've always been a person that goes against the grain. Ever since I'm a kid, I've gone against the grain. I can't remember a time in school where I wasn't getting in trouble and wasn't, being labeled, the bad kid or the class clown or whatever. But in my life, I have had the opportunity to really discover my own greatness. I'm not saying that to toot my horn. I'm just saying that I figured some stuff out. And the things that I have figured out have led me to be a best-selling author, a high-performance mindset coach. I've worked with millionaires, billionaires, and even people in the working class, whether it be janitors or whatever. I've worked with people from all walks of life. And one of the things that I've figured out is most people generally want the same things out of life. Most people want to be successful at some level and whatever success means to them. But at the same time, most of those people have no idea. Like they just don't have a blueprint or a roadmap that they can follow that will get them to where they want to be in life. And so they settle. And we'll talk a lot about that. And we'll talk about some of the mindset and some of the thoughts and the reasoning that cause people to settle in their life. But I'm telling you, I believe that every human being comes into this world with inherent greatness. And so let's go ahead and we're going to take a breather and we'll come right back and continue on with what this is all about. Hey, and welcome back to the Punkest Thing Podcast with your host, the punkest daddy of them all, Gregory Downey, known by many as the Gratitude Coach. And we are moving on. And so the next question is, well, what? What am I going to be talking about during our time together? And it all goes back to this question, well, what's the punkest thing you ever did? And that's what we're going to be talking about, because there's a lot of punkest things I ever did. And one of the punkest things I ever did was choosing not to conform. The other punkest thing I ever did is I chose out of mediocrity. One of the other punkest things I ever did was I chose into greatness. What does that mean? What does it mean to choose into greatness? For me, it was recognizing that anything that I want to do, anything that I want to be, anything that I want to have or be, do, have in my life, I have the capability of being and doing and having everything that I want to be, do, and have. And so do you. In fact, it's more important that you understand that you have the ability to be, do, and have anything that you want to be, do, and have in life. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter where you were born, how you were raised, what your circumstances were, right? Because if you believe that you cannot be, do, and have the things that you want to be, do, and have in life because of some outside circumstance, that is just a program. That is just a story. And I'm going to help you break out of that. So it's really important to understand that even though I will talk about some things like law of attraction, even though I will talk about some things that delve into the metaphysical realm, this podcast is not about religion, right? Some of you may do a little research on me, and you may find that I do have a strong faith-based background. But that's not what this podcast is about. And I do not plan to make this podcast about that. Now, talking about things like law of attraction may inspire you to seek out more spirituality in your life, and that's okay. It's not about politics, right? You may do a little research and you may find out that, he has this political view, or, that he falls here on the political scale or spectrum or whatever, and that's okay, right? We don't have to agree on politics. And this show is not about politics. However, if you listen to this podcast, talking about things like attraction and abundance and empowerment, it may affect how you interpret politics. It may affect how you interpret the agenda of different politicians and people of influence. And it may affect how you choose to engage both politically and socially. But that's not what this podcast is about. It's just not about that. This podcast is about helping you to give yourself permission to tap into your greatness, right? Not that you need permission, but sometimes, there have been times in my life where I felt like I needed permission not to do what was expected of me, because what was expected of me was just to be mediocre, right? I was the kid that I think nobody counted on, really. I don't want to go too deep at this point into the story around my father, but some of you have read my book. And if you haven't read my book, I'm not really here to plug the book. Well, I'll probably plug the book quite a bit because I think it's a pretty awesome book. And it became an overnight bestseller on Amazon. And it rose really quickly to hot new titles like the first day it was released. It's called Attracting Miracles. And in that book, I talk a lot about, how I was brought up and what life was like living with my father, because it wasn't easy. Like now, all of the stuff between me and my father has been resolved. Like I have full love for him. I have no hard feelings or ill will. I realize 100% that I am who I am today because of the experiences that I got to have growing up in my father's house. It really had helped me become who I am. And there have been other people along the way. There are people that I talk about in the book, but there have been people along the way that have helped me to become the person that I am, even if at the time it was a hard or negative experience, right? And so I don't want to make this podcast, about all of that. I mean, we're not going to erase it. It's not going to go away. I mean, it is what it is, and it's there in the book for you to read. But I will say that, that growing up in the circumstances that I grew up in, it was pretty freaking challenging. Like it wasn't easy. When my father passed away, I actually had the opportunity to speak at his funeral. And I was really candid, about the fact that growing up in his house, wasn't easy. Like the lessons that were there to be learned were sometimes really, really super hard, right? Not easy, because it is what it is, man. He just was not an easy dude to deal with. He was rough. You can ask any of my friends that spent any time around our house, that like growing up around Dan Downey was not an easy thing for my brother and I. But the fact of the experiences have helped to shape me into the person that I am today. And I'm super, super grateful for all of that, for everything that I experienced, even down to the fact that, yes, it is true that, my dad tried to kill me. Probably he tried to kill me more than once. I just didn't realize the other times that he was trying to kill me. But the time that he tried to kill me, like he was trying to kill me, like had the gun to my head. And luckily the gun didn't go off. And I had the opportunity to get out of the truck and to run away. And so, I don't want to go too much into that experience. Again, it's in my book. You can read about it. Because I want to be cheerful. Like I want to be happy and joyful here. And I don't want to, want any of this to be a downer experience for anybody that chooses to tune in and to listen to this podcast. But, there's a lot to be said, about what it means to not conform. And, conformity, well, let me say it this way. There was a philosopher in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and he was a bit of a philosopher and a psychologist. And his name was Rollo May. And at that time, Rollo May said that the opposite of courage in our society is not cowardice. It's conformity. People doing what everybody else is doing because everybody else is doing it. And anybody who knows me, anybody who's been around me for any length of time knows that I'm an inherent nonconformist. And so by the time I was in college and I was playing in a punk rock band, and, we were playing lots of shows and had a pretty big following, and we played the Vans Warped Tour, and we were actually getting ready to be signed on a decent sized label. There was a decent sized label that was really interested in us, and things were going really well. And at that time, it was so interesting to hear, what people would say about this idea of selling out. Oh, well, you guys are selling out, and having access to the internet at that time made it much easier to see and to be exposed to the things that people say within the punk rock subculture about this idea of selling out. And for me, like I didn't want to conform at all to anything, that people said that we should be doing as a punk band. At the time, every song that I wrote, I wanted it to have a message, right? I had this, I had this vision, like I really did. I had this vision that I was going to be like the Tony Robbins of punk rock, and And so I really felt like if I was going to be on stage, or if I was going to be, in a crowded living room, or if I was going to be in a crowded garage, or if I was going to be playing in somebody's front yard or backyard or wherever we were playing shows, because we played in all of those kinds of places, believe me, I felt like I had a responsibility to say something meaningful. Like if I was going to have your attention, for 20 or 30 minutes, I really felt like I had a responsibility to say something meaningful, right? To give you some value, to transfer something to you, especially a bunch of kids who were at an age where they're super, super impressionable, making huge decisions about the rest of their life. Decisions that most of them probably weren't very well equipped to make. I know that I wasn't really well equipped at that age. And so I just really felt like I had a responsibility to say something important and meaningful. And so I wrote songs that had lyrics that were, meant to be inspiring and meant to give people hope and meant to let people know that they can be amazing and that they can do hard things. And so that in and of itself, I was just not conforming. I wasn't conforming to, everything that every other punk band around us or every punk band that we were listening to was saying at the time. It just was in my DNA to not conform. It just got so old, man, that people would throw labels and they'd say, "Oh, you guys are pop, or whatever. You guys aren't punk enough, or whatever. You guys are this or you're that." And you know what? Most of the people, they weren't in a band. They weren't putting themselves out there. They weren't stepping up and trying to do something to make a difference in the world. They were just calling down insults from the cheap seats. And so I think it was just kind of natural, that when I decided to do this podcast, I decided I wasn't going to conform. I thought to myself, man, there doesn't need to be another podcast about law of attraction. I mean, there are a ton of those out there, and there are some really good ones. There doesn't really need to be another podcast that's, about personal development. There doesn't need to be another podcast about a lot of things, around self-growth. And even though inherently my goal is to help people discover their greatness and to break out of mediocrity, this isn't about, being part of what everybody else is doing. Right? This is having the courage to say, hey, I'm going to do this my way, and I'm going to take my little podcast raft, that I'm building out of sticks and twigs and, maybe some empty soda bottles and, putting it all together, and I'm drifting out into blue ocean, where it's more risky and there's less protection. But that's who I am, and that's what I want to do. I want to do something that's different than anybody's ever doing. And this is one of the punkest things I've ever done is, to stay true to myself and not conform. Because that is the punkest thing, right? Resisting mediocrity, breaking out of the status quo, deciding not to be average. So let's go ahead and take a little break. And then, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit who I am and what I bring to the table for you. Welcome back to the Punkest Thing Podcast. I'm your host, the Punkest Daddy of them all, Gregory Downey, known to many as the Gratitude Coach. And this segment is called Who? And this segment is called Who the Hell Are You? So, and this segment is called Who the Hell Are You? So who am I? Wow, that sounds like an existential question. Who am I? What is my background? Right? What are my unique qualifications in general that might give me the ability to help people identify, discover, and magnify their own greatness? Well, so first of all, you know the name's Gregory Downey. You know that some people call me the Gratitude Coach. You may not know that I've got 8 kids. So to many of those kids, I am daddy. And have been daddy for, going on like 21 years now. And my kids range from 21 down to 2. And my 2-year-old actually calls me Dada, which I don't know. Looking back, I don't even know if any of my other kids ever called me Dada. But anyway, doesn't matter. So I am. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I am the global mindset and culture lead for a large global company that is a luxury bed maker based here in Sweden, and that's actually where I'm podcasting from. I'm in Sweden right now. Come this fall, we'll be back at our house. We also have a house in Malta, which is just south of Sicily. But I'm the global mindset and culture lead at Heston's, have been since about July of 2017. And everything that I do, everything that I am, everything that I bring to the world in a professional capacity is all about mindset. It's all about values, all about culture, and all about helping people to be their very best self. And so what I do at Heston's is I help to elevate the mindset and help everybody within the organization become their best self. Because one of the things that we know, one of the things that we know at Heston's is that if I can help people to be their best self, well, they bring all of that to their role and their position in the company. And so before my time at Heston's, I was with an organization called Achieve Today. And Achieve Today, before that, was called Prosper. They went through kind of some name changes, but they were Prosper Learning. And before that, I'd been with other organizations. But I started out in the coaching industry in 2005. And that was with a company called the Professional Education Institute. Before that, they were called Franklin Covey Coaching. They also, went through some name changes along the way. And while I was at the Professional Education Institute, or PEI, I was actually hand-selected to be one of the founding members of Jack Canfield's Success Principles coaching program. And I actually ended up being a top producer, and that was really cool because, to come right out of the gates and to have a really strong performance and to bring a lot of value, that was something that was super important to me. And I still hold that achievement very close to my heart. And so I'm trained in neuro-linguistic programming. I'm trained in empathic listening. I'm a trained mediator and negotiator. I'm trained in mindset coaching at many levels. I have many certifications in mindset coaching and have all sorts of other, study and training in my professional education, or my formal education, my collegiate education. I have a couple of degrees. I have a 2-year degree in, speech and interpersonal communication. And then I have a 4-year degree in marketing communication, and have also, spent time working in marketing and copywriting and advertising and so everything that I've done professionally mostly has had to do with influencing people and their decisions in some way. And so, that's a bit about my background. Before I went into coaching on a professional level, I had a lot of involvement in sales and selling, and I've been involved in direct selling and building networks, and I've had a lot of exposure to being in environments where the people that are there and the people that are involved are working to help other people around them to have their best life possible, right? And it was in 1996 that, wait a second. No. Yeah. It was still 96, I believe. It was in 1996. It was fall of 1996. I was approached by a gentleman at an Albertsons supermarket in Pocatello, Idaho. And he recruited me for this direct selling organization, and I got involved, and he said, there's this event that you really need to go to. Like, if you want to be serious about this and you want to really do something with it, and you want to build it big and get some results and make money and all those things. He said, you've got to come to this event. There's going to be this event down in St. George, Utah. And he said, you just have to go. And so I was, recently married, recently moved to Utah, flat broke. I mean, like, seriously, we were broke. Like, didn't have a whole lot of coin to rub together. And, that's something I'll talk about, probably in other episodes, going from being quite successful, for my age and, status in life to, being broke and not even being able to find a job, because people didn't want to hire me because I was from California. And Idahoans at the time, they didn't really like people from California. So when they would find out that I was from California, they just would never call me again. But that's beside the point. But anyway, so I went to this event. My wife and I went to this event, and we helped pay for gas, paid for our hotel, paid for the tickets, and it was a big stretch, and it was a big leap of faith on our part to do this, because it was a time when we didn't always know when we were going to have money again. I mean things were really, I'm telling you, things were really tight. My wife was working at the time. She was working for Marriott, which became Sodexo, at the college that I was going to. And the extent of my work, like, I was doing work study on campus because that was like all I could get hired to do. And so, and I think we had a little bit of money set aside, maybe, from student loans that we had taken so that I could, start going to college. And boy, that's another story. Like, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I'll talk about that. But we went to this event, and, I was sitting in the crowd and just really overwhelmed with what I was seeing and what I was hearing and what I was being told was possible for me, not just in business, but in life. Because here were these people, that were standing on this stage in this arena. It was like it was at Dixie State University, and the arena was full. I mean, it was packed with people that were, super engaged in an effort to become financially free, right? In an effort to take back their sovereignty in more ways than one. And for some people, that meant a goal of not having to ever have a regular job again, right? That meant that they didn't want to ever have somebody identify as their boss and be telling them, what they could do, when they could do it, how could they could spend their time, when they could use the bathroom, when they could eat lunch, all of these things that represented to them, right, being a slave to a job. And not that jobs are bad. I mean, look, hey, a lot of people need a job in order to pay their bills. But a lot of other people have this vision of being free from the need of a regular job. And I'll tell you, when I sat in that crowd, there was a guy who came out on stage, and his name was Glenn Wallentine. And Glenn told the story of how he had gone out and put together this business, and how that business grew, and how his income grew, and how at 24 years old, it put him in a position to walk away from ever having to have a job again. And at the time, he was working at a place called Pepperidge Farms, and I think it was in Logan, Utah. But he told the story of how he had gotten himself to a place financially and in his mindset where he was ready to walk away from his job for the very last time. And I remember sitting in the darkness of that arena, listening to him tell that story of getting free, being free. And thinking, man, how punk is that? How punk is that? How non-conformist is that? How breaking out of mediocrity is that? That at 24, he had put himself in a position where he no longer, and would never again, have to have a regular job. Now, like I said, I don't have anything against people who have a job or having a job. I've had many jobs. In the situation that I'm in now with Heston's, I'm an employed person. I'm employed by Heston's. Now, it's not by any means, the standard, typical, or regular job. I love what I do, but it is far from average or far from typical. And that's what I love about it. But this whole idea of at 24 years old, being in a position to walk away from having a job for the very last time, that got inside of me in a way that very few things have ever gotten inside of me in my life. And it went in and it got stuck. And it got stuck deeper than any addiction. And I'll tell you, it was like an addiction, like an obsession. This idea of just being free. I listen to that. Being free. Freedom. Answering to nobody. Now, obviously, you kind of got to, answer to people in your life. Like, if you're in a relationship, you have to answer to your partner and you got to answer to your kids. But what for me, what freedom meant is being in a position where no other human being outside of the people that I love and care about, no other human being was going to have control over what I do with my time, over what I do with my resources, and the choices that I make for myself and for my family. And so that idea of freedom went in and got stuck. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this podcast is going to be about sovereignty and the sovereignty over your own mind, sovereignty over your own choices, your own life, sovereignty over your own decisions. And when I talk about sovereignty, it's about ownership, right? It's about freedom. And it's about being responsible and having control over yourself and as many aspects of your life as possible. So let me look at my agenda here, make sure that I'm staying on track and covering everything that I wanted to cover during this episode. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I know I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, about, what is my relationship to punk rock. And I talked about Big Brother Glenn and how he introduced me to the first punk bands I'd ever heard. And then there was Jeff Nagel and Jack Ralston were the two guys that hung out with the girl that lived across the street from me, Shauna, and her best friend, Eileen. And they were, guys that I thought were just the coolest. But then, as I had mentioned, and maybe if I didn't mention it, maybe I did. I'll go back and hear it in the edit. But Jack Ralston turned me on to a radio show called Maximum Rock and Roll. Maximum R&R for short. It actually started out as a zine, like a DIY published magazine of sorts, and then became a radio show on KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley, California, and then was rebroadcast. Out of KFCF in Fresno. And this show was on every Tuesday night, and it came on at like 10 p.m. And right at about the time that Jack Ralston turned me on to Maximum Rock and Roll, it was right about the time that I was being sent away to Archbishop Hannah School for Boys, Hannah Boys Center for short. And it was interesting because lights out at Hannah Boys Center was 10 o'clock. And that was when Maximum Rock and Roll started. And so I would hide under my blanket with this little Radio Shack like earpiece. Of course it was, really probably 1960s, 1970s technology. Hadn't gotten any better in the 80s. They did have earphones or headphones in the 80s, but you weren't supposed to be listening to the radio or having any media going on after lights out. And there was a night watchman that would come around. And so I would have that earpiece in my ear, and then I would have my head against the pillow and then have my blanket over my head so that way, I could be concealed and listen to Maximum Rock and Roll for the 2 hours that it was on. And I can't even count or express how many punk bands I had been exposed to through that radio show. And some of the bands I discovered even back then, we're talking, this was 1986, 1987. And then I listened all through high school up until about 1990 when I moved to a place that I couldn't pick it up anymore. And there was no internet, so... But it's interesting because I would record with my little boombox. I would record whole segments of this show, and I would record these segments because they had these set lists of all these bands from all over the world, And one of the coolest things, and might I mention that the radio show was started by a guy named Tim Bohannon. And one of the radio hosts was actually Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys. But he didn't go by Jello like when he was on the show, at least not when I was listening. He went by his regular name. And they would like the people that were hosting the show would have their own sets. And they would play sets of like 4 songs. So they would introduce 4 songs, and usually the songs had a common theme, like what country they were from or what style or whatever. And they would rotate, and all of the hosts during that particular show would play, these sets of music. And it was really cool because every host, had a different style that they liked, and they were on a list where they would get vinyl and cassettes sent to them from around the world because, everybody knew that there was a good chance that it was going to be played on Maximum Rock and Roll. And so I would listen and record all of these show episodes. And then I would redub the songs that I liked into my own compilations. Now, a lot of people call it a mixtape. I've never, ever used that term. In fact, I didn't even learn the term mixtape until, I was in my early 20s in college. But I always, knew the term compilation. And I bought compilations and made compilations. And, to me, if you have multiple bands on a single CD or tape back then, as it were, that was a compilation. And so I was making my own compilations religiously. And, I remember my favorite, the best compilation I ever made had, it was the first time I had heard Stiff Little Fingers. It was the first time I had heard Screeching Weasel. I believe there was a Sam I Am track on there. There was just all of this amazing music, and a lot of it is stuff that I still listen to today, like Screeching Weasel, still by far one of my favorite punk rock bands. The Vandals, like I first heard the Vandals on Maximum Rock and Roll. I first heard No Use for a Name on Maximum Rock and Roll. And this was, like I said, during the late 80s. Trying to think who else was on that initial, D.I. Richard Hung Himself. That was on that compilation. The list goes on and on and on of just amazing, iconic punk rock bands that I had been exposed to that I still listen to even to this day. Now you got to keep in mind that I grew up in Sonoma, California, which is the outer North Bay area of San Francisco, and the fact that that I could even get KPFA was in some ways it was a small miracle because there were other places around town that you could not get KPFA, but where Hannah Boys Center sat, like where it sat kind of, against the foothills, so it was slightly elevated, it just made it possible for me to get reception. And so that was super cool. But, you got to remember that this was 1986, 87, 88, 89, 90, and 86 and 87, it was the heyday of East Bay Area punk rock. Bands like Isocracy, The Accused, Operation Ivy. Lookout Records was around already by then. The list goes on and on. Clown Alley, Christ on Parade, I probably already mentioned Isocracy, but Monsula, it just, the list goes on and on of, who I was, what bands I was exposed to and who I was listening to at the time. And I remember, by the time I got to high school, I was in the 9th grade. I'm going to, this upper crust Catholic high school in Napa, California. And, here I was a scholarship kid, very working class background, going to school with, a bunch of other kids, whose parents were, owned wineries or were physicians, high power attorneys, maybe worked in the, the financial district of San Francisco. And, here I am, working class kid, going to this, really upper crusty, for lack of, it was a preppy school, college prep, Catholic school. It was Christian Brothers High School called Justin Siena in Napa. And literally, even back then, the cost of tuition for a year of high school was equal to that of some of the finest colleges in America. And there were 3 other people that I knew in high school, in that school, that listened to punk rock as religiously as I did. One of them, actually, the bass player from a really, really amazing band. They were kind of 77 style, but kind of, like the Misfits, and they were called Viper, Vyper. And the bass player, really super cool guy. And he's actually a fashion designer and makes a lot of his own looks. And his whole thing is to find designs secondhand and then to upcycle them, and does a really amazing job with stuff. And his name is John Prudenti. Back in high school, he went by Johnny Prudenti. And so if you want to check out his style, his looks, his fashion, you can find him on Facebook. It's Prudenti. First name John, and I think he even has an Instagram. But check out his stuff. He's super, super talented, super, super artistic. And he was the bass player for a band called Viper, and found out that I listened to punk and got really excited and actually floated me their demo tape. And man, I wish I still had that. I lied. Okay, so there was another guy that listened to punk as well, because we would talk about stuff and exchange tapes back and forth. And his name was Kevin Maher. And Kevin was into punk rock. Another guy in the school listened to punk rock, guy by the name of Rick Smith. He also listened to punk. And but I'll tell you, the guy that was like the encyclopedia of punk rock was a guy that when I would take the bus, we would sit on Wednesday and talk about what we had listened to on Maximum Rock and Roll the night before. And, we would compare stuff that we were buying and listening to. And his name was Justin Farrell. And just the super nicest, super coolest guy you'd ever want to meet. And, all the time was like sitting toward the back of the bus, had his headphones on, and was always listening, to either a punk or hardcore or thrash band. And we would, for bus rides on end, we would compare, what it was that we were listening to at the time. And interestingly, most of my friends, however, were into metal. And I have nothing against metal. I went through a phase for, it was probably 4, maybe 5 years at the most, where I was listening to a lot more metal. I really don't listen to much metal now at all. I haven't for years. Really, probably stopped listening to metal in 1991, I want to say. I had been, punk rock kid playing in a metal band. We were called Malefactor, and this was in Lodi, California. One of the other members of the band, Justin Kane Meshew, bass player. Gerald was the lead singer and other guitar player. And then we had another guy in the band who wasn't really a metalhead at all, but he liked playing metal. He also was really into funk and was into thrash and liked this group called Tower of Power. I guess they're funk. His name was Philip Martinez, and he actually went on to play drums for a really famous Bay Area, I want to say they're like a goth band. I'd have to go back and look at what the name is. It kind of escapes me right now, but anyway, so that whole thing kind of came to an end in like 1991. And I was really only listening to metal at that time as far as, I was playing in a metal band. And, but all along, even during the times that, that maybe I was, showing up looking pretty metal, I had long hair, absolutely I was listening to metal, but really, my heart has been, punk rock. Like it's everything about punk music still appeals to me even this day. There are bands that I listen to now that, that probably aren't as angry as a lot of the bands I was listening to back in those days. But everything has remained, punk to this day. I followed the evolution of punk and got into emotional hardcore, which then evolved into what was called emo, Midwest emo, screamo, or, sometimes people refer, to 90s emo and screamo as scrams. It's not anything that you would look at today that is identified as emo. I mean, it's not even remotely, well, I shouldn't say it's not remotely related because it kind of is, but what people call emo today came out of the post-hardcore and the kind of the scene, music scene. And it's not a fair representation of what it was, back when I was listening to it, because going as far back as Maximum Rock and Roll, I was listening to Sam I Am, in their earliest days, before, and I can't even remember if they were being considered emo core in 87, 88. But that was my first exposure to Sam I Am. Was, they were playing shows with Crimp Shrine, Isocracy, Monsula, and they were all playing at Gilman in Berkeley, the Gilman Street Project or Gilman Warehouse. It goes by lots of different names, or lots of different ways that people refer to it. And when I was in college, excuse me, when I was in college, I was in college starting in 1996, but when I was in college beginning in like 1998, I actually had my own radio broadcast for 2 years, and it was a punk, I played punk rock music and did commentary on the news, and it was affectionately called the Gilman Project. And it was a nod to the Gilman Street Project in Berkeley. And this is hilarious. During that time, I formed a punk rock band, starting with a couple guys. One of the guys was Rob Smith, who played bass, and he had a good friend that was named Brandon Rosenberg that played drums. I was introduced to them through a guy, by the name of Sterling. And Sterling was friends with these guys, and we had been talking and shared common interest in punk music. And I said that I was looking for a band, and he's like, I know this guy that plays bass and a guy that plays drums. And so he arranged a time for us to get together and to jam and to kind of see what the chemistry was like. So I go to the place, where we're going to set up and where they had been playing already. And I set up my amp and plug in my guitar, and we start talking. It's like, okay, well, what song do you know? What song do you know? Is there a song that the three of us know together? And so we ended up jamming out to a MXPX song that we all knew in common. And the cool thing was that they were really surprised that I could actually play guitar, because there had been a lot of people, that had told them, oh, we want to start a band, and, yeah. And then it would turn out that they couldn't really play, or didn't play very well. And so they were just totally blown away that I could actually play guitar. I'd been playing in bands, going all the way back to junior high school, and spent a lot of time, dedicated to playing guitar. And so the fact of the matter, I consider myself a good guitar player, and it was totally fun because, Rob at the time was really dedicated to playing bass, and he was a pretty good bassist. I was 26. I think I was 25 or 26, maybe, still in college, because I started late. And both of them were like 19. And they just couldn't believe that I could actually play. And they were just super excited because they had been wanting to really have a band, where we could, go somewhere and play some shows. So the chemistry was good. We decided, that we would be a band. We decided on the name Slackjaw at the time. It ended up not sticking, and that's another story. But the funny thing is that because my radio show was called The Gilman Project, Rob and Brandon, somehow, we'd been playing in a band together for months, and neither of them knew that my first name was not Gilman. Like, they just assumed that was my name. And so they called me Gilman. And, when they learned that my name was actually Gregory, like, they were really quite surprised. But to make a short story long, we'd been playing together, probably a week or two, maybe 3. And, we'd had some practices, and we were just playing cover tunes at the time and working on maybe 1 or 2 originals. And we got to the point where we were, pretty tight as a unit. And I said, okay. I said, we've got something here. And I said, now we're going to fatten our sound. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And I said, I got a guy. And this is a guy that I had met probably, like 2 years before. When I first started college in 96, he was working at the record store Hastings in Twin Falls, Idaho, close to where my wife's family lived. And I would go in there when we would be visiting my wife's family on the weekends, when we were when I was out of school and she was not working. And we would drive over to Twin Falls, Idaho from Pocatello, and met this guy, and his name was Brant McCombs. And, we'd had a lot of conversations, shared the similar interest in the same bands. And turns out that he also played guitar, had a van, had been in some bands. So I knew, that if we brought Brant into the band, that like it would complete our sound. I knew that he, had material he'd already been working on. He owned a van. So that was like, really, that was premium. And so I had his number because I said, hey, we ought to get together and jam sometime. So I call him up and I said, hey, Brant. I was like, this is Gregory. I said, what do you got going on? And he's like, I don't know, what's up? And I said, put your guitar and your amp into your truck. And I said, and come over to my house. And I gave him the address, and he was there in less than a half hour. And he comes in. We're already set up in my living room. And the little hovel, I said, set up your stuff. So he sets up. So I kind of went through that conversation again. Hey, what covers do you know? This, that, and the other. And so we picked a song that we knew mutually, and we played it. And I just remember like how big Brant was smiling, and he was nodding. And I said, so, are you in or are you in? And he's like, man, I'm in. And that was how that band, No Faced, that eventually took us to play the Vans Warped Tour, that was how it came together. And, it's, it is still a very, very deep and emotional experience in my life because we set a goal. Like I told those guys, I told them, I said, look, I said, I'm on a mission to play the Vans Warped Tour. And I think at times they probably didn't believe that it would actually happen. And I remember how surprised they were, and how, Brant had played in bands before, but I don't think that any of the bands he'd played in were as good as we were, because we were good. And we had good chemistry, and it was clear that we were going to, take it and go somewhere. But we'd been playing together for maybe 60 days, 90 days, something like that. I don't even think it was that long. And I said, okay, now we got to play some shows. And all of a sudden, whoa, they put on the brakes and the fear sets in. And, it's just all this, we're not ready. And I was like, no, we're ready now. We're ready. We're going to play shows. And I'm going to get us our first show. And there was a dude that lived in Twin Falls. I met him in school. No, I lied. I didn't meet him in school. I actually was working with him at the jewelry store. His name was Otto. That was he went by Otto. Otto was his last name, but his first name was actually Brian, but he went by Otto. And he let us play our first show in his garage. And it was middle of winter in Twin Falls, Idaho. And it was freaking cold and it was wet outside. But I'll tell you what, we packed that freaking garage and, and we played that first show like it was the last show we were ever going to play. Like we played our guts out. And I just remember, when we got back together at our next band practice, we were all still riding that high, because there are very few things in life that compare to having a guitar strapped around your neck, having a microphone stand in front of you, and being, in an intimate space with a bunch of kids, just packed in front of you, and rocking out to music that you and your band wrote, and just sharing that experience. I mean, if you've ever had that experience, you know what it's like, and you know how addicting it can be, to be in that setting. And, looking back on all the shows that we played, and there were tons of shows and tons of different types of venues, I've been a goal digger. I set that goal. I set a goal. I set the intention and had a goal to play the Vans Warped Tour, and we did it. And from then on, I just knew that dreams could be real, that dreams could absolutely be real, and I was not ever going to settle for not reaching my dreams. And so if you follow me on this journey and you go with me in this podcast, you're going to find that the things that I'm going to share will give you the courage, the inspiration, and even some instructions on how to make your goals and dreams a reality, and how to live free, and how to be a sovereign person, and never, ever, ever submit to conformity, and always resist mediocrity. From the Punkest Thing Podcast, I am the Punkest Daddy, Gregory Downey, known to some as the Gratitude Coach. And this has been Testing. Is this thing on? Episode number 1 of the Punkest Thing Podcast. Until next time, there's greatness in you. Go find it.
I'm coloring outside your guideline. I'm passing out when you were passing out your room. 1, 2, 3, 4, who's punk? What's the score?
This has been the first episode of the Punkest Thing Podcast. Check 1, 2. Is this thing on?